the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, April 14th, 2015. Paying tribute to lost elders. We'll celebrate the legacy today of the late Eduardo Galeano by hearing him read his own works. And acclaimed writer and talk show host Tavis Smiley joins me in studio to discuss his new book, My Journey with Maya, about the late, great Maya Angelou. Smiley will also discuss his earlier book, Death of a King, the real story of Dr. Martin Luther King's final year. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen, author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
A year after 250 girls and young women were abducted in Nigeria, events are taking place to mark the one-year anniversary of the horrific mass kidnapping that sparked global attention. The hashtag #BringBackOurGirls campaign received widespread support, including from famous figures like First Lady Michelle Obama and Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai. The Nigerian group Boko Haram claimed responsibility for the abductions from the northeastern region of Chibok, and since the first incident, there have been other kidnappings, bringing the total to about 2,000. Most of the girls remain missing. A new report by UNICEF released yesterday adds to the grim picture. 800,000 children are reportedly among the 1.5 million internally displaced refugees inside Nigeria, pushed out of their homes by ongoing violence. Bob, are people making enough connections between Boko Haram's violence and Western corporate culpability?
Well, Sonali, your question implies that it's not enough to just condemn terrorism and condemn ideological extremism, but it's actually important to understand the context. Are you making such a radical claim? My God. And of course, if you look at Nigeria, it's a place where that corporate culpability is most obvious. Remember, Nigeria just became an independent country in 1960. Its oil resources have been dependent on the exploitation of foreign companies, especially U.S. companies like Chevron. And it was those companies that allowed Nigerian dictators to really run roughshod over the population. Where do groups like Boko Haram emerge from? They emerge from in countries where other kinds of movements, secular movements, can't achieve the basic aims of human decency. And I think we do have to bear some responsibility for that here.
Nearly 8 years after employees of the private security contractor named Blackwater killed 17 unarmed Iraqis, a judge just sentenced 4 men to lengthy prison terms. Nicholas A. Slatton was sentenced to life in prison, and his 3 fellow Blackwater staffers were handed down 30-year sentences. The incident took place on September 16, 2007 in Nisour Square in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad at the height of the U.S. war. Among those who testified at the trial was Muhammad Hafed Abdul Razak Kinani, whose 9-year-old son Ali was among those killed. Kinani told the judge yesterday Blackwater had power like Saddam Hussein. The power comes from the United States. Blackwater, which has since been sold and renamed to Academy, received more than $1 billion in government contracts related to the war. Bob, how unusual is this verdict and sentencing, and is it even a small measure of justice for the injustices of that war?
Well, it is unusual, and it is a small victory, and I would emphasize the small. I couldn't help but think of the My Lai massacre when this verdict came down. Remember that during the Vietnam War, the war crimes of the U.S. military were kind of everyday occurrences, and that came to a head with the My Lai massacre, and it was appropriate that the people who committed that massacre were charged, but we have to remember the larger picture. So instead of looking at only these 4 people in Blackwater, we might remember that Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, was complicit in this. And then we might remember that it was the U.S. government that hired Blackwater, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq itself was a crime against peace. U.S. troops committed war crimes on a routine basis. And so, yes, whenever people who commit violence like this are held accountable, it's a good thing, but only if we keep that larger picture in mind.
And finally, about 24 protesters interrupted a lunchtime meeting of hundreds of hedge fund managers and investors in New York yesterday. The activists called on investors to require higher wages for workers at companies like McDonald's and Burger King, as well as the Darden family of restaurants, where some of those present apparently invest their money. They chanted dignity at Darden, no poverty wages, and pay your workers, shame on you. The protest came a day after the UC Berkeley Labor Center released a report called The High Public Cost of Low Wages, According to the report, the huge profits that companies make by refusing to pay their employees a living wage are propped up by $153 billion a year in taxpayer subsidies in the form of public assistance. Tomorrow is a national day of action by the Fight for 15 campaign. Bob, can wealthy investors be shamed into raising wages?
I feel there's a kind of a trick question there. Can wealthy hedge fund managers understand what shame might be? Do they have a conscience is a question. And I'm not going to speculate on that. I'm not a theologian. But, it's really not the investors we care about. It's the public pressure that can be brought to bear on them. So the Restaurant Opportunity Center, which organizes this protest, is one of those really creative groups that's making these issues visible. But we have to remember that it's power, and power traditionally in this context has come through organized labor, that really is going to make the big changes. So it's good that these new tactics are highlighting these questions. It's good that reports like the Berkeley report point out that the concept of a free market is an illusion, that the government is involved in these questions at all levels, including, in that sense, subsidizing corporations. But in the end, it's a revitalized labor movement, I think, and a labor movement that moves forward, not just looks to the past. That's going to be so crucial.
Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on and have your analysis on this program. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. He's our daily Newsflash guest expert on Tuesdays. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Eduardo Galeano, one of the most celebrated writers of Latin America, passed away yesterday at the age of 74 from cancer. His most recognized and celebrated work was his 1971 book, Open Veins of Latin America, 5 Centuries of the Pillage of a Continent, which was translated into more than 28 languages. In 2009, then President of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, offered a copy of the book to U.S. President Barack Obama at the Americas Summit in Trinidad and Tobago, catapulting it into an instant bestseller. Originally from Uruguay, Eduardo Galeano was the recipient of many international awards, including the Casas de las Americas Prize, the American Book Award, as well as the first Lenin Prize for Cultural Freedom. He lived in exile in Argentina and Spain after being imprisoned and forced to flee his native Uruguay following the 1973 military coup. He returned to Montevideo in 1985 and lived there until his death. Today we mark the passing of Eduardo Galeano in the best way possible, through his own voice and his lyrical writings. Eduardo Galeano spoke in 2006 at an event in Berkeley organized by our sister station KPFA, where he presented a new book. Here he is reading some short chapters.
I'm going to read some short stories from the last book I have committed. In English, the English version is called Voices of Time. From moles, we learn to make tunnels. From beavers, we learned to make dams. From birds, we learn to make homes. From spiders, we learn to weave. From tree trunks rolling downhill, we learned about wheels. From tree trunks floating and adrift, we learned about boats. From wind, we learned about sails. How did we learn our evil ways? From whom did we learn to torment our neighbors and subdue the earth? Many are the rings inscribed on their trunks, these giant trees, heavy with years, have spent centuries chained to the depth of the earth, and they cannot escape. Defenseless against chainsaws, they crack and fall. Whenever one topples, a world comes crashing down, and flocks of birds are left homeless. And will the old trees are fated to die? In their place grow profitable young saplings. Native forests give way to contrived forests, order, military, industrial, triumphs over the chaos of nature. Pine and eucalyptus grown for export look like soldiers in formation marching off to the world market. Fast food, fast wood. Man-made forests grow overnight and are sold in the time it takes to say amen. Source of hard currency, triumph of development, symbol of progress. These wood farms suck the land dry and leave the soil barren. No birds sing in them. People call them forests of silence.
Eduardo Galeano, who passed away yesterday at the age of 74. He was speaking in 2006 at an event organized by KPFA Berkeley. This is Uprising. When we come back, Tavis Smiley joins me in studio to discuss his new book, My Journey with Maya. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? You can watch the show on Free Speech TV, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel for a very small monthly fee, which helps us sustain the costs of TV production. Find out more at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. It's been less than a year since one of the greatest American artists, Maya Angelou, died. On May 28, 2014, the incredible singer, songwriter, poet, activist died at the age of 86. There is little that Maya Angelou did not do in her life. As a child, she lived through grinding poverty, sexual abuse, a difficult family life, prostitution, and several marriages. For a few years, she lost her voice entirely as the result of a deep trauma. And when she found her voice, she never stopped. She was a streetcar conductor, a calypso dancer, a stage and film actress, a singer, a film director, a screenplay writer, a civil rights and anti-apartheid activist, a mother, and of course a poet. And she traveled the world over, learned several languages. She was a professor, a lecturer, a teacher of philosophy, ethics, theology, science, theater, and writing. She won numerous Grammys, was nominated for a Tony and a Pulitzer. Her life was so varied and full that it's no wonder she wrote 7 autobiographies, the first of which catapulted her to fame, called I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, published in 1969. In 2011, President Obama presented her with the Medal of Freedom. Maya Angelou influenced a huge number of people directly and indirectly. Directly, she influenced my guest, the popular broadcast journalist and writer Tavis Smiley, whose new book pays homage to a woman who was a mother figure and a mentor. Tavis Smiley is the host and managing editor of Tavis Smiley on PBS and the Tavis Smiley Show from Public Radio International. He's a best-selling author who's written 12.5 books, and he now joins me in studio to discuss his latest book, My Journey with Maya. Welcome to the show, Tavis.
Sonali, good to be on. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, you began your friendship with Maya Angelou in the early 1990s when you accompanied her on a trip to Ghana, where she delivered the W.E.B. Du Bois lecture. Set the stage for us first in terms of where you were personally and professionally. You hadn't yet embarked on your journalistic career, and in a way it seemed as though, at least from your book, she provided just the spark you needed.
Yeah. I was 21 when I first met her. She's a 21-year-old kid working for the mayor of this city then, Tom Bradley. And the mayor was out of town one day, and as was often the case, when he couldn't make an appearance somewhere, he would send me to represent him. So I love this. So here's my chance now to go present a letter of welcome at this gathering to Maya Angelou. I'd read her poems and memorized some of her works when I was a college student, but now here I am now, just a year removed from college, getting a chance to go meet her face to face. I meet her for less than 5 minutes, Sonali, but in that 5 minutes, there was something so powerful about her presence. I said to myself, at some point later in my life, I have got to find my way back into her space. This is someone I'd like to get to know. I had no idea, fast forward a few years later, that I would have run for the city council here in Los Angeles, lost that city council race. And it seems laughable now that I thought my life was over in my mid-20s. The problem is that when you fail at the one thing, the only thing that you think you were born to do, something takes leave of you. I didn't know what to do, what the next step was. I didn't know what my role in the world was. Didn't know how to find my own voice or make my own way. And in that very moment, to your question, I get this invitation to go to Africa for 2 weeks with Maya Angelou, to carry her bags, essentially. But in that 2 weeks in Ghana, a wonderful friendship blossomed, but most importantly, she let me listen to her and learn from her and laugh with her and eat with her and be loved on by her to help me try to figure out what my role in the world was. And that started a 28-year friendship.
Wow. Well, let's hear Maya Angelou in her own words before we continue with this story. 40 years ago in 1975, Pacifica Radio's Lynn Harris interviewed her, and here's an excerpt from that interview.
Allows another being to another human being, her or him, to see her his most at base. That's it. Yeah. Such generous gestures.
All right, we're going to try to get that for you very shortly. We're having some technical difficulties with that. But when we do get that lined up, how important was it and for you to ask Maya Angelou questions about about her past, about her whole life? You were burning with all of these questions.
First of all, it means something when you're a 20-something-year-old African-American male and someone of her stature says to you that you matter, that your life matters, that your opinion matters, that your viewpoint matters. They want to get to know you. They want to ask about your family, about your upbringing. I mean, she was interested in me. I mean, clearly at this time, Sonali, there's a huge gap between her intellect and my intellect, a huge gap between her age and my age, 30-plus years, a huge gap between her worldview and her experience and mine. And clearly, there's the gender gap.
Yeah.
And she did not allow that to foreclose on a friendship developing and blossoming. And so I am so grateful as I look back on that all those years ago that she didn't treat me as a bag carrier, so to speak, but she welcomed me into her world. And so she wanted to know my opinions, what I thought about this, what I thought about that.
And she often sought out the opinions of young people.
Absolutely. And that's why she moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina to teach at Wake Forest, because she was so turned on by young people. Yeah. I believe and argue in the book, in the introduction, in fact, as you ran that list in the introduction, your beautiful introduction of this conversation earlier, when you ran that list of all the things that she did, I can't think of another American woman who has been more Renaissance than Maya Angelou. If you ask me who's the most Renaissance man in the country's history, I'd say Paul Robeson. But for women, a lot of great American women. But Maya Angelou did so many things and did so many things well. It's hard to imagine anybody more Renaissance than her. And at the time, I knew she was very special. But over the course of that 28-year friendship, and all the conversations and our travels and our dinners, and she's staying at my place and I'm staying at her house, and all these things that we did together, it was just the most wonderful experience of learning from someone who is so wise. Yeah. It was great to have her around.
I think we have that clip lined up. We're going to try one more time to get, this is Maya Angelou speaking to Lynn Harris in 1975 in an interview preserved in the Pacifica Radio archives.
when I'm asked, you know, how did you make it, you know, uh, if one looks at my life and considers that an anthropologist or sociologist would look at my early life and say I'm a born loser, have to be. Child of a broken family, raped at 7.5, growing up in poverty, black in the South without parents, direct parents, an unmarried mother at 16. It would seem that, you know, there's no way out. But I've had so many people be kind to me, and I've always recognized kindness. When a human being allows another human being to see her or him at his most base, that's a gesture of such generosity that it's hard to even write about it. But it does in turn, hopefully, make me generous.
And it did, I think, make her generous to you and to all of the people she touched in her life. Maya Angelou, talking about the things that she went through. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading your book, Tavis, was that she never followed a script. There was no path. She sort of defied so many expectations. And as you were saying in your point in your life when you thought that you had a career in politics and then that failed, and in a way she helped you discover, although she didn't tell you directly you should go be a radio commentator, right? So tell us a little bit about those moments in Ghana. What was it like to be in Ghana with Maya Angelou? How did she influence the way you even saw that country?
Well, first of all, I'm in my 20s. I'm just a kid. I've never left the country. So I'm leaving the country for the first time. I'm going to Africa, black man, going to the motherland, going to Africa for the first time. Going with Maya Angelou. When we get there, we're greeted by the president. It never occurred to me that African countries actually have black presidents, African presidents. And here I am for the first time in my life meeting an African president of a country who's greeting Maya. She had lived in Ghana earlier in her life, as you know, Sonali. So now this is a huge homecoming for her. So they roll out the red carpet. The presidential motorcade is there. She's not staying at a hotel. They invite her to stay in the presidential palace. And so I'm hanging out with her in the presidential palace. And then because she was there to give this major address, as you mentioned at the Du Bois Institute, a lot of iconic figures know she's coming back home. And they want to be in Ghana to watch her give this major address. So Stokely Carmichael shows up. Miriam Makeba shows up. The great historian John Henry Clark shows up. These are all the people that I'm sitting around and sitting amongst, listening to them talk. And I was there as, again, to carry bags and just to stay out of the way, but to be able to sit in and listen to those conversations. And then for Maya, at any number of points, to pull me in. What do you think about this, Tavis? What do you think about that? What's your viewpoint about this? I mean, I'm being asked to be a part of these conversations, and it's clear that she values my opinion. And so for almost 2 weeks in Africa, these conversations get more organic and more dynamic, and just sitting and listening, as I said earlier, and learning and laughing and being loved on by her was amazing. And then when she finally, at the end of our trip, Sonali, builds up to the final, she gave a number of addresses, but the big one was this Du Bois Institute lecture. And the refrain that she kept using that day in an almost hour address, the refrain that she kept coming to, that she built the speech around, were these words: we have already been paid for. We have already been paid for. Her point is that the service and the sacrifice and the struggle, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the deaths of those millions of Africans lost in the Middle Passage, we have already been paid for. And she's basically looking at me in this audience saying, because we've already been paid for, there is a debt that we owe. We can never fully repay this debt, but it's our job to make a down payment on that debt. And so I'm taking all of this in, and I'm looking at all these folk around me who have found their own voices. And it's abundantly clear to me that I do owe a debt, that there is something that I have to do with my life. And she says to me in our last conversation, back to your initial comment, in our last conversation, she says to me, when I want her to just tell me how this is going to work out, how do I find my voice, what is my way, what is my role, what is my place? She looked at me and she said, baby, we find our path by walking it. Yeah. We find our path by walking it. And that goes back to what you said earlier. She never allowed the journey that she was on to obstruct her view of where she was headed. And she understood that for all the different things that she tried, all the things that she did, she had to find her way, as you heard in that clip. She was written off by some people, but she had to find her way by walking it. And that's what she said to me. We find our path by walking it. And that wasn't the answer that I was looking for, but I held on to that. And I held also on to one other thing she said on that trip. As we talked about the fact that I had lost this city council race and I didn't know what the next step in my life was or how to find my voice, she said to me, we find our path by walking it. And she said to me, maybe you should consider that rejection is redirection.
Right.
That rejection is redirection. You see it as rejection, but maybe the rejection is redirecting you to where you really need to be. And that's what opened the door for my mind to consider that there was another way to love and serve people. And here we are, 28, almost 30 years later. I figured it out.
Well, Tavis, she was friends with a great many number of incredibly well-known people. Among them, of course, your idol, Martin Luther King Jr., who you describe in your book had a very profound impact on your life early in your life when you heard his sermons. But she was also friends with and colleagues with Malcolm X. And what lessons were there in the way in which she navigated her relationships between these two men who represented two different ways in the civil rights movement?
Maya said to me all the time, one of her favorite refrains was, I am human. And because I am human, nothing human is alien to me. I am human. And because I'm human, nothing else human is ever alien to me. There's so many ways to take that beautiful phrase. But to your question now, it allowed her to respect. That belief system allowed her to respect, not just respect Sonali, but to respect and revel in the humanity of everybody. It's that clip we heard of her a moment ago. What allowed her to be so generous to everybody else was the path that she had walked and all the trouble that she had endured and all the folk who had been so kind to her. I believe that gratitude is the gateway to greatness. Gratitude is the gateway to greatness. And if you can find in your life a way to be grateful for the people, for the places, for the experiences you have, then your life will be that much greater. And so because she lived in a place of gratitude and was generous and wanted to find that thing that made everybody so special, she could be friends uniquely with both Malcolm and Martin. And that was always fascinating for me. And so to sit in Ghana, and even after Ghana, all the 28 years of our friendship, to hear her tell me stories, to regale me with stories of her friendship and her times with Malcolm X, to her conversations about her time with Martin King. And of course, she and Dr. King have a unique and eerie sort of connection. Yeah. She's born on April 4. Dr. King is assassinated and killed on April 4. As a matter of fact, she's in New York on her 40th birthday. Yeah. She's preparing for a big birthday party that night to celebrate her 40th year of living. And it is on her 40th birthday that her friend, Martin Luther King Jr., is assassinated in Memphis. For years after that, she wouldn't even celebrate her own birthday. It didn't feel right. Until one year, Coretta Scott King sent her a beautiful bouquet of roses and said, you must live. Life goes on. And from that year on, every year on April 4, Maya would send Coretta Scott King flowers. Coretta Scott King would send Maya flowers, and they did that every year until Coretta Scott King passed away. But it's a wonderful lesson about how, again, we don't ever contest the humanity of individuals, that none of us has a monopoly on the truth, that we have to be open to having our assumptions re-examined. When we don't close ourselves off to different ways of thinking, we expand our inventory of ideas. And the fact that she could be friends with Malcolm and Martin said to me that I've got to be open, I've got to be charitable, I've got to be generous. There's a reason I've got one mouth and two ears. I have to listen to what people have to say if I want to be made a better person.
And I think that was one of the things that really jumped out at me from your book, is that she had so many lessons that you were lucky enough to get first person from her, but so many times in our movements, you know, among particularly people on the left and progressives who are desperately struggling to find answers to injustices, we're not kind to one another either. And she described, you described how she navigated conflict, how she handled anger from other people. You point out some examples of how gracefully she would handle, in one particular instance, a student who asked her an aggressive question in a lecture, even an encounter with Tupac Shakur. Can you tell us those stories?
Yeah, she was on the set of a film, Poetic Justice, that was starring Janet Jackson and Tupac Shakur. She's in her trailer one day, and outside she hears this awful tirade of cursing. And she listened for a minute, and it got louder and more. It got more boisterous. And so she steps outside the trailer to see these two young men who are cussing each other out and they're about to go to blows. And being Maya, she boldly stepped in between the two of them, a woman, steps in between these two black men who are about to go at it and cussing each other like nobody's business, and pulls the most aggressive one to the side, and basically talks to him. And she said, when's the last time you were told that you were loved? When's the last time you were told that you mattered? Why are you behaving in this way? Tell me what is bothering you. She literally talked him down from this perch that he was on, this angry perch, and has a brilliant and loving conversation with him, and until the conversation diffuses this situation. And when all was said and done, she goes back into her trailer. A few minutes later, there's a knock at the door of her trailer. It's Janet Jackson. Janet Jackson says to her, Dr. Angelou, I just watched what you did. Do you know who you were talking to? And she says, no, I saw two young men. I wanted to diffuse the situation. She said, that was Tupac Shakur. Maya had just got on the set and had not met Tupac Shakur.
Right.
So here she is talking to Tupac Shakur about his life and about his worth and his value, and she didn't know who he was. And she said, baby, I wouldn't know Tupac from Six Pack. I had no idea who he was. But weeks later, she said she got a handwritten letter from Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mother, and Tupac had shared with his mother the story of his encounter with Dr. Angelou that day. And his mother, Afeni, was writing Dr. Angelou to tell her thank you for being so kind and so generous and so loving toward my son. So even Tupac Shakur was able to get away from her love, her kindness, and her generosity.
She was also an incredible cook.
Oh yeah.
And she loved to host dinner parties. How important was food and even drink, a little bit of indulgence? How important was that to her? Because when we think about, so many of us are sort of worried about what we eat and eating right, and we're told constantly that if we want to keep our minds sharp, we should avoid these things. But she just enjoyed herself.
She did. She enjoyed herself. And the beautiful thing about the food is that every meal for her was an event. And I never ever considered that. She had one of her last books was a book called Hallelujah, the Welcome Table. And that's what her table was at her house. It was a welcome table. You were welcome to sit around her table. I describe in the book some of the meals that we had from time to time. I describe in the book how as many times as I ate with her, I never sat at the same place setting one time, because every meal was an event. So the napkins were different, the silverware the cutlery was different, everything, the glasses, the china, everything was different at every meal, because every meal for her, these dinner parties were events for her. And so the food was part of the joy, part of the celebration, but more than anything else, it was the conversation. Now, she was a great cook. She did a number of cookbooks that were all, very much best-selling books. So again, part of her being a Renaissance woman. But I've come to look in my own life, I've tried to emulate her, and I still do, Sonali, of course, try to emulate her in so many ways. And so when I have dinner parties at my house, they become events. And it's about me bringing my friends together around my welcome table and enjoying the food, but more so enjoying the conversation, enjoying the good company. And we never know. Here's the truth of the matter. We never know when our last time is going to be to sit with friends, to sit with family. We live in a crazy world, and things are happening that we don't always understand, and some things out of our control. And you just never know when the last time is going to be that you'll be able to break bread with a family or a friend, family member or a friend. And so I've in my own life started to take my own dinner parties and my own gatherings with friends. Whenever I go to a city, I've been on book tour for a few weeks now, and whenever I'm in a city on book tour, I have friends, multitude of friends in most major cities. And when I go to those cities, I always make sure that there's one night on my schedule after the book signing that all of my friends meet me at a particular restaurant. And I usually rent out the back room or something so we can have some privacy. And we sit around, sometimes 10, 12, 20 of us. But we sit in the back room. I bring all my friends because I don't have time to go to see each one of them individually. But I invite them all to join me for a dinner, whatever city I'm in, so that I can make sure that we spend time together. Because I never know when I'm going to get back to New York or Atlanta or Chicago. And I want to make sure that every time I'm there, I get a chance to see them, because I never know when the last time might be.
Life is short.
Yes.
Maya Angelou had an incredible sense of humor. The photographs that we see of her, she's smiling, she has a twinkle in her eye. And on the issue of food, staying on that for a second, I just loved the poem that you quoted of her. She recited this poem to you called The Health Food Diner. Honestly, this was just such a fantastic poem where she was telling you a story about being at a health food diner in Los Angeles.
In Venice, yeah.
Where she encountered a vegetarian restaurant.
That's right.
And she noticed that all the people looked a little pale, and she thought, oh, they must be here like me, coming to get better, but it turned out that they had been eating there for a long time.
Yeah.
Could you maybe read one of these verses? I mean, it's just.
So,
and she wanted to smoke at the restaurant.
Exactly. So she's in this vegetarian restaurant, to your point, and she told the waitress, she said, I wouldn't tell people that these folk eat here all the time, looking the way they look. And so she was inspired to write this poem, and it's called The Health Food Diner. No sprouted wheat and soya shoots and Brussels in a cake, carrot straw and spinach raw. Today I need a steak. Not thick brown rice and rice pilau or mushrooms creamed on toast. Turnips mashed and parsnips hashed, I'm dreaming of a roast. Health food folks around the world are thinned by anxious zeal. They look for help in seafood kelp, I count on breaded veal. No smoking signs, raw mustard green, zucchini by the ton, uncooked kale and bodies frail and sure to make me run. 2, loins of pork and chicken thighs and standing ribs so prime, pork chops brown and fresh ground round, I crave them all the time. Irish stews and boiled corned beef and hot dogs by the scores, or any place that saves a space for smoking carnivores.
Just loved that.
I loved it too. It's funny. And she recited that to me. She was telling me this story. And so I had to go into the research and find that poem and put it in the book. Yeah.
So she had this incredible sense of humor. She didn't take things too seriously, except, of course, when they deserve seriousness. And of course, there's so much to learn from her. She also was able to recite poems. She had so much art at her fingertips.
That's right.
And of course, she was quintessentially an artist. Can you tell us a little bit about the conversations that you had with her around blues and around jazz music, two of the most important art forms pioneered by African Americans in the United States?
Blues, jazz, gospel. You would never hear Maya in a performance, and I don't even so often use the word performance describing what she did publicly, because it wasn't just a performance. I call it the Maya Angelou experience. To see her was to experience her. But you'd almost never see her on stage without her singing once, twice, 3 times in the middle of a lecture. She would always break into song to make her point. Sometimes blues, oftentimes gospel, sometimes folk, but she would always break into a song as a way of pulling the audience in, as a way of explaining her point, as a way of sharing her gift with them. Of course, in her earlier life, as you mentioned earlier, she had been a singer, a calypso singer, so singing was not foreign to her. And one of the things that she told me, Sonali, in Africa, she said, Tavis, you are going to travel the world. I encourage you to travel the world and to get to know humanity, not just in the United States, but humanity the world over. And she said to me, everywhere you go, and Quincy Jones later, my friend Quincy later told me the same thing. Maya said to me, everywhere you go, there are 3 things I want you to do, wherever you travel. Learn a few words in their language, eat their food, and listen to their music. Learn a few words in their language, eat their food, and listen to their music. That, she said, Tavis, is how you become a citizen of the world. And so music was such an important part of her life, not just here domestically, but everywhere she went, she wanted to learn songs in the native tongues of persons around the world. You'd be amazed, I was amazed, blown away consistently over 28 years at the number of songs that she would call, number of songs that she would remember that she would break out singing in the native tongue of the countries where she learned these songs. And so the fact that she was so cosmopolitan, we go back to her being the ultimate Renaissance woman. She was so cosmopolitan in her views, in her worldview, in her cultural aesthetic. She never again saw any art being foreign to her.
She appreciated and loved Shakespeare.
Absolutely.
She even taught Shakespeare.
Right? and my favorite, which is funny to me, I used to hear her all the time refer to this person called Eep. She'd call him Eep. Eep this, and here's why I love Eep, and Eep said this, and let me tell you what Eep said. It's always Eep, Eep, Eep. And one day I said to her, Maya, I said, who is Eep? Because I'm feeling a little stupid now, because she's quoting these poems and things, and I have no idea what she's talking about. Oh, I'm sorry, baby. Eep is what I call my friend Edgar Allan Poe. So Edgar Allan Poe was who she was referring to when she said Eep. So she loved poetry, and she had her favorites, of course. But no art, again, not unlike human beings, no art was ever foreign to her.
Yeah. I'm speaking with Tavis Smiley. Tavis, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I want to talk a lot more about both Maya Angelou, based on your book, My Journey with Maya, as well as your earlier book, Death of a King, the real story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s final year. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. We continue now our conversation with my guest, Tavis Smiley, whose latest book is My Journey with Maya. He had a 28-year friendship with the late Maya Angelou, passed away last May. Now, one of the things, Tavis, that Maya did, just kind of following up on what we were talking about before in the earlier part of the program, was that she never really had a rigid path for where she was going. She didn't hesitate from taking controversial positions, for example, and occasionally she would find herself isolated. And you described this interesting encounter in your book where you disagreed with her position on Clarence Thomas and his nomination to the Supreme Court. She had written an op-ed defending that nomination, and you and her did often disagree, but and I think the way in which you disagreed with each other also tells a lot, also has some lessons about how we talk to one another. Can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, there was obviously a huge gap between her, again, her experience, her worldview, her intellect, than mine. And yet she never allowed that to, again, foreclose on a friendship, always inviting me to interrogate her, to question her, to intellectually tussle with her. She welcomed that because she believed, as I do, that we are made better when we are challenged to re-examine the assumptions that we hold. It's in these...
And she never got defensive, as far as I could tell from your book.
Never got defensive. And in these moments of intellectual contestation, we have our inventory of ideas expanded. Yeah. And so she was always open to that because she was such a person who was always interested in learning and in living. And so she welcomed my interrogating her, and so I took her up on that when it came to this op-ed that she had written in the New York Times defending Clarence Thomas. You can go online and read it. It's there, and perhaps the most controversial thing she ever did. But one thing, I think the essential argument she was trying to make in the op-ed was that even if we don't agree with another human being, and she was saying to black folk, even if we don't agree with him in his positions heretofore, we have to give him a chance, give him an opportunity. We don't ever throw human beings away. I think, respectfully, she made a mistake. It was a bad decision. We talked about this. And I think as her life went on and Clarence Thomas's tenure on the Supreme Court continued, I know she came to realize that it had not worked out the way she thought. I don't know if she thought at some point his blackness was going to kick in, or the fact he was born poor in Pinpoint, Georgia, might somehow, bring some clarity and good sense to him. I don't know what she thought was going to happen, but it didn't quite work out that way. And so I think she obviously recognized that. But in our conversation, she never backed off the fact that she thought that she was giving him an opportunity for the right reasons, which again was respecting and trying to revel in his humanity and believing that if given enough time, he would essentially, come around. That's how I would paraphrase what her op-ed was. We disagreed about that. And there were a number of things, to your point, Sonali, we disagreed about. But the beautiful thing about the book, as you'll see, as you know, you've read it, is that no matter how much tension there was in a conversation, every conversation always ended on a love note. It was like John Coltrane, Love Supreme. Everything ended on a love note. And again, for me to be Tavis Smiley and, to have Maya Angelou allow me to interrogate her, invite me to disagree with her, and never be defensive about that, never take anything personally, and always end every conversation on a love note. Again, all of her behavior was suggesting lessons to me about how I wanted to live my life and how I want to treat other people.
And I really felt that from reading the book as well. There's so many ways in which we can choose to behave, and those make big differences in how we create community.
If I can jump in right there, there's something she said to me all the time that it's a lesson that I want to share with the audience because it's something that I learn perennially. There are some lessons in this book that will make sense to you and you'll get it immediately. Other lessons that you're going to be, again, learning if you hold on to it for the rest of your life. And one of those perennial lessons is simply this. Maya suggested to me one day that there's nothing that we ever have to say or do to another human being that we cannot find a way to say or do in love. Now, that's a tall order.
Wow.
Think of all the things that we have to do. Sometimes we get divorced. Sometimes we discipline our children. Sometimes we have to fire employees. There's nothing that we ever have to do, says Maya, that we can't find a way to say or do in love. Now, that's something, again, that I learned perennially. But if that becomes the goal in your life, to do and say everything in love, then it does make you reconsider how you make decisions and how you treat fellow citizens.
Now, so many people that she was contemporaries with, who were her contemporaries, whether early on or later on in her life, she saw them be cut down in the prime of their lives. You mentioned Dr. King, of course, who was assassinated on her 40th birthday, and of course then Malcolm X. Before that, even international figures like Patrice Lumumba. Each of them was a blow to her, as one can only imagine. How did she deal with death? What were the lessons that we can learn from her about how we can handle death?
That death doesn't have the last word. One, how we live our lives every day is what we control. We don't control death. It comes to each of us. And so that's a fight that Maya wasn't willing to have. She says in her own words, I surrendered that fight a long time ago because what is going to happen will happen when it's supposed to happen. What I control is how I live my life every single day. And what I'm not going to allow to happen is for misery to have the last word. Misery is not going to have the last word. And so it's really about how we choose to live every day. She reminded me consistently that choices have futures. Every choice has a future. And so we choose how we live our lives. And this is something I've come to consider. This is not a lesson that Maya taught me, but in hanging out with her, I've come to accept this as my own philosophy about death, which is that our work becomes our afterlife. Our work becomes our afterlife. Right. So if we do high quality work, we never really die because our ideas, our art, our contributions go. We're still talking about Beethoven all these years later. We're still talking about Shakespeare all these years later. And years from now, we'll still be talking about Maya Angelou. Can I have the book just for a second?
Yes.
I want to just read, if I can.
Yes.
I chose this piece personally to go on the back of the book. When you publish a book with a major company, people have ideas about how things ought to be laid out. And typically on the back of the book...
You must have glimpsed at my questions because I literally have a note here asking you to read that out on the show.
I did not glimpse at it. My eyes aren't quite that good. But your question about death brings me, you see why, brings me to this passage. And so we had a conversation at the book company about whether or not we were going to put blurbs on the back of the book from people embracing and touting the book. And I said, no, I don't really need that. Maya's life speaks for itself. We don't need blurbs on this book. What I'd rather do is to put this passage from the book on the back of the book. And here's what it says. I don't know how I knew this, Tavis, but in the deepest part of my soul, I understood that the adventure itself required courage. And because I didn't want to miss out on the fun, I didn't want to deny myself the sheer joy of going through this human form with all its heartaches and joys. I simply did what was required. I mustered up the courage to forge ahead. Because of that, I have lived the life that I wanted to live. And so can you, Tavis. So can everyone. What she's saying, obviously, is if we muster up the courage to make the tough choices, each of us can live the life that we want to live. She told me, you can do that, Tavis, and so can everyone else.
I'm wondering, Tavis, she passed away just before the spark of the Ferguson protests were lit last summer, and we seem to today be at a moment of heightened awareness of the problems of racism in the United States. And since you knew her so well, I'm wondering if you would consider speculating how she might have seen this moment that we are in today, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example.
Well, speculate is a good word, but it's really not necessary, because when you talk to people about people like Maya Angelou or Martin King, they lived through these occurrences in their own lives.
Yeah.
She lived through the Watts riots.
Yeah.
She saw the Newark uprisings. She saw the Detroit riots. Of course, we all lived through the Los Angeles riots. So this is not something we have to speculate about. She saw this and lived through it. I think both she and Dr. King believed that violence is both impractical and immoral. So that violence is not the answer to our crises and to our problems. On the other hand, because she loved young people so and loved seeing them engaged, she would absolutely be celebrating the advocacy of these young people for justice and for fairness. And she'd make a distinction between, charity and justice. There are a lot of people who are engaged in philanthropy and think that all we have to do is give a little money here, do a little charity work here. But justice is a very, very different situation and issue. And so she'd be absolutely celebrating the fact that these young people are finding their voice, are making their way in the world, are trying to make the world better when they leave it than when they found it. That's a beautiful thing to see young people engaged in that way. It is the reason why she moved to Winston-Salem to teach at Wake Forest. She loved young people. I'm exhibit A of what happens when she comes into contact with a young person whose mind she finds to be fertile. She wants to feed that. She wants to support that. She saw herself as a gift that she wanted to share with other people. And so I suspect that were she here now, she'd absolutely be celebrating the advocacy of these young people, but again, telling them to behave and to work in ways that would not be counterproductive.
Now, your book, My Journey with Maya, is your second book of this year, and it's only April.
Yeah,
In January, you published Death of a King, the real story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s final year. And King, of course, deeply influenced you and has influenced you. How important is it for us to clarify his legacy, particularly in that final year, where he did become a very controversial figure in the U.S.? And we forget that because we've kind of deified him now, and how he was being seen by elites in the day. Why is that so important?
In the last year of his life, to your point, he's persona non grata. He's become a pariah. Hard to put the word pariah and king in the same sentence, but that's what he was. April 4, 1967, he gives a speech called Beyond Vietnam, where he calls the U.S. the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, and then says if we don't get serious about the triple threat facing our country, we're going to lose our democracy. That triple threat: racism, poverty, and militarism. Racism, poverty, and militarism. For giving that speech and for coming out so aggressively against the war in Vietnam, everybody and everything turned on him. The media turned on him. The White House of Johnson turns on him. They disinvite King to the Johnson White House. And then white America turns on him. The last poll taken in his life found that nearly three quarters of the American people thought he was irrelevant. Almost 60% of his own people, black people, almost 60% thought he was persona non grata. And I mean the NAACP turns on him, the Urban League, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Ralph Bunche, Thurgood Marshall. Everybody turns against Dr. King in the last year of his life. And so King in the last year, Sonali, he can't get a book deal. He can't get a paid speech. He's not welcome in black churches. The organization he runs is bankrupt. He personally dies bankrupt. Harry Belafonte has to pay for his funeral. And of course, there were death threats all along the way. So this is the story of Martin King that we really don't know, of the price that one has to pay for living his life by a certain set of immutable principles, and for standing in his truth. But it's a story that I think we have to know if we're ever going to truly appreciate King for who he was. His life didn't stop after I Have a Dream. This last year is the critical and crucial year to understanding who he really was.
And this year we are seeing a ramping up, I mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, but we're also seeing a ramping up of a movement for economic justice tomorrow, major National Day of Action for the Fight for 15 campaign. And these movements are being led by poor people of color, demanding higher wages, demanding unions. Do you see this as a continuation of Dr. King's work?
Oh, absolutely. When he was assassinated, as you know, his primary mission and focus was his Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
And they cut him down in part because he was coming to Washington to set up a tent city on the National Mall. In other words, Dr. King was going to be the original Occupy movement, but he wasn't going to New York in Zuccotti Park. He was going to the National Mall to set up a tent city, and he and thousands of others were going to camp out and live on that National Mall, Sonali, until they did something about poverty. So this is a continuation of his work, and we need to be clear, it's not just about poverty and income inequality. What we're really talking about here is economic immobility. A way to allow people who are poor to move up from their poverty, come out of that station in life. So there's always going to be, to some degree, income inequality. We have to fight that issue. But it's really economic immobility that's keeping poor people down. And so I celebrate all of those persons who are engaged tomorrow and the days ahead on this issue of poverty. I think very simply that poverty is now threatening our very democracy. I think that poverty is a matter of national security, and that we're simply going to lose our democracy and become a plutocracy, an oligarchy, but we will not be a democracy if we don't get a handle on this income inequality and this economic immobility that threatens to crush this very experiment called America.
And of course, our audience can check out your views on this topic in the book that you did earlier, The Rich and the Rest of
With
Us.
Cornel West.
With Cornel West.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you so much,
Thank you,
Tavis
Sonali.
Smiley, for joining us today and spending this time with us. I certainly feel like I learned so much through you from Maya.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was the
thank you.
intent of your book.
That is the intent, and thank you for saying so.
Thank you.
And thank you for your work.
Oh, appreciate it.
And your
that.
witness. I appreciate it.
This is Uprising, and I've been speaking with best-selling author Tavis Smiley, whose book, My Journey with Maya, we've been discussing, as well as a little bit his earlier book, Death of a King. And this is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.